In the third week of May, 750, the city of Paris went looking for its king with murder in mind. It started with a rumor, and the rumor was this. Children were vanishing off the streets. Beggar children, apprentice boys, little girls sent out to fetch bread. The police were taking them. And the police were taking them, people said, because the King of France had grown sick in some private way that ordinary medicine could not touch, and his doctors had told him the only cure was to bathe in the blood of the young. It was not true. None of it was true. But on the 23rd of May, a crowd cornered a plainclothes police officer named Lebel near the Rue Saint-Roch, accused him of stealing children, and beat him to death in the open street. The riots that followed had to be put down by force. When it was over, the authorities hanged 3 men in the Place du Grève to make the point that you do not tear a city apart over a story. And the king heard what they were saying about him, that he drank the blood of children, and he stopped traveling through Paris altogether. He had a new road cut so his carriage could reach Versailles without passing through the capital that hated him. According to the memoirist who recorded it, he said he did not see why he should ride through a city where the people called him Herod. Herod, the king in the Bible who slaughtered the innocents. What nobody knew at the time was that the house they were terrified of, the secret place where the king supposedly kept his victims, did not yet exist. The building that history would brand the Parc-aux-Cerfs would not be purchased for another 5 years. The legend was already running. The fact had not even started. That gap between what the king actually did and what France decided to believe he did is the whole story, because the lie would outlive the man, and 40 years later it would help carry his grandson to the scaffold. Versailles, the Saint-Louis quarter, 1755. On the 25th of November that year, an agent acting for the crown bought a small townhouse on a quiet residential street, the Rue Saint-Médéric, a short walk behind the palace. Number 4, it was not a wing, it was not a pavilion in the gardens. It was a house on a street where court musicians and minor officials lived. The kind of address you would walk past without a second look. And the name. This is the first thing the legend gets wrong. And it is worth getting right, because almost everyone gets it wrong. The Parc-aux-Cerfs was not a poetic nickname for a park stocked with girls. It was simply the name of the neighborhood. More than a century earlier, Louis XIII, who loved to hunt, had fenced off an enclosure here to keep deer, a stag park. Louis XIV later built over it and turned it into housing for the people who served the court. By the time Louis XV bought his townhouse there, Parc-aux-Cerfs meant a postal district, nothing more. The dirty meaning, the idea that the words themselves implied a den of vice, came afterward. The legend renamed the place in its own image. So what went on inside number 4? Here is what the records actually show, and the records are not a mystery, because in 1864 a Versailles archivist went back through the original deeds and accounts and laid the whole thing out, document in hand. The house was small. Usually there was a single young woman living there at any given time, with a chambermaid and a servant and an older woman put in charge to keep order. Sometimes the place sat empty for 6 months together. This was not a seraglio. It was a discreet bachelor arrangement run on the king's private money for a man who happened to be the most powerful person in Europe and did not want his affairs conducted under the eyes of the entire court. The man who actually ran it was not some sinister procurer out of a novel. He was the king's senior valet, a servant named Lebel, who had been with Louis his whole life and was trusted with everything. Lebel found the women, mostly in and around Paris, mostly from poor or lower middle-class families. He arranged the introductions, and when an affair ended, which it usually did within a year or two, the same machine that brought a girl in arranged to send her back out, and it sent her out with money. That is the part the legend never mentions. The women were married off. They were given dowries, sometimes very large ones, sometimes with jewels on top, and matched with husbands who were told only as much as they needed to know. One contemporary account describes a girl sent away with a dowry worth a fortune. Pregnant women were moved to a separate house to give birth quietly, and the children were provided for. You can argue about the morality of all of it. But the popular picture, the dungeon full of weeping captives, has nothing to do with the paperwork. The king himself, by most serious accounts, never even lived there and rarely, if ever, visited. The women were brought to him, discreetly, through the warren of private staircases inside the palace, up to a tiny room above a guardroom that the people who knew about it nicknamed La Trébuchet, the bird trap. I mean, think about that for a second. The single most photographed palace on earth, 500 rooms of gold and mirrors, and the actual scandal happened in a converted closet above the guards, reached by a back stair. The reality was smaller, shabbier, and sadder than anything the pamphlets would later invent. So how many women are we really talking about? The number that gets thrown around in the legend runs into the hundreds, the thousands. The historian Théophile Lavallee, working in the 1800s, put the real figure at about 30. 30 women across the 16 years the house was kept, from 1755 until the king sold it in 1771. The 1864 archival study, the one that went through the deeds, reached the same conclusion. Roughly 30, not 30 a year, 30 in total. The same ironic little fact that made this place so easy to mythologize, that it was secret, is exactly the fact that let people fill the silence with whatever they feared most. A house nobody could see could hold anything you imagined, and France imagined a great deal. But that is getting ahead of the story. If you have ever seen an 18th century painting of a young woman lying on her front across a rumpled couch, you have probably seen Marie-Louise O'Murphy, even if nobody told you her name. She was born in Rouat around 1737, the youngest daughter of an Irish immigrant family, with, to put it gently, a complicated relationship with the law. The painter François Boucher used her as a model. She was 14, maybe 15. The picture made her, in the words of one of the German museums that holds a version of it today, something close to the first pin-up in European art. And it brought her to the attention of the court. The story that Casanova discovered her as a filthy little urchin and sold her up the chain is exactly the kind of story Casanova liked to tell about himself, written down decades later, and historians treat it with the suspicion it deserves. What the more reliable records show is that the introduction ran through the circle around Madame de Pompadour and was finalized, as always, by the valet Lebel. O'Murphy had a daughter by the king in 1754, and then she made the one mistake the system did not forgive. She tried to use her position to push against Pompadour herself. She lost. She was out of favor and out of the picture by 1755. Married off into the provincial nobility, exactly the way the machine was built to do it. Hold on to her. We are going to come back to Marie-Louise O'Murphy at the very end of this, because what happened to her after Versailles is one of the strangest endings in the whole story. She was not alone, and the others are documented too. There was Marguerite Catherine I know, who was at the house at the start of the 1760s and bore the king 2 daughters. There was Lucie Madeleine d'Estaing, around the same years, who also had children by him. There was a young woman remembered as Mademoiselle du Tillet-Soulan. This is where the story takes a turn nobody expected, because one of these women looked at the arrangement and said no. Her name was Anne Coupier de Roman, and rather than live quietly in the little house on the Rue Saint-Médéric and be married off on schedule, she got her own establishment, a house at Parcy on her own terms. When she had the king's son in 1762, she pushed for something none of the others got: recognition. And she got it. Her boy, Louis-Aimé de Bourbon, was the only illegitimate child Louis XV ever formally acknowledged. He was raised, given a churchman's career, and allowed to carry the name. You'd think someone would have written all of this down at the time and put the legend to rest. Nobody did. The official silence was total, by design, and silence is the richest soil there is for a rumor. Now, about the ugliest part of the legend, because this channel does not flinch, and this audience does not want to be lied to. The pamphlets that came later claimed the house was stocked with children, little girls of 9 and 10. That claim is a fabrication, and it is worth saying so plainly. The documented women were teenagers and young women, mostly mid-teens and up, standards of a century that married girls off appallingly young. That does not make it clean. There is a vast gap in power between a poor 15-year-old and the King of France, and no dowry closes it. But the specific horror that France would later scream about, the king as a devourer of small children, was not happening in that house. It was invented, and the invention, as we are about to see, was a deliberate act. That distinction between a squalid truth and a monstrous lie is the hinge the entire French monarchy would eventually swing on. If the way a story about a dynasty's private rot turns into the thing that destroys it is what keeps you watching, then the collapse of the Romanovs is the same machine running at full speed, and I put the whole story of where their family ended up in another video. It is linked at the end of this one. Stay with me, because the next part is where this house stops being gossip and becomes a weapon. By 1775, the year after the king was finally dead, the house on the Rue Saint-Médéric had been sold for 4 years and stood empty of any scandal. That is exactly when the scandal exploded. Because in 1775 a book appeared, printed with a fake London address to hide where it really came from, called The Anecdotes about Madame de Pompadour. The man behind it was a journalist and police informer named Pédant du Maire Aubert, and it was not a pamphlet you skimmed. It was a fat, well-written 300-page thing that read like a serious biography, which was precisely what made it so dangerous. Here is the detail that everyone missed at the time, and that the historian Robert Darnton dug out 2 centuries later by going through the actual order books of an underground publisher. That book was not fringe. It was one of the best-selling banned books in all of pre-revolutionary France. By Darnton's count of the orders, it sat at number 2 on the list of forbidden bestsellers, behind only a single utopian fantasy. People could not get enough of it, and inside it, the Parc-aux-Cerfs was no longer a discreet townhouse with one tenant. It was a harem, a grave of innocence, a machine for swallowing victims. And if that one book had been the only problem, the monarchy might have survived it. But then, in 1781, came a 4-volume monster called The Vie Privée de Louis XV, The Private Life of Louis XV, again with a fake foreign imprint, and Darnton calls it the most important work of its entire poisonous genre. 4 volumes. Rain retold trade as one long story of a king rotting from the groin outward, with the secret house at the dead center of it. This is the book that took the numbers into the stratosphere. Where the real figure was around 30 women over 16 years, the Lebels spoke of a constant supply, an industrial harvest of the young. Where the real cost came out of the king's private purse and ran to dowries and pensions, the pamphlets put it at 1,000,000 livres, and then later writers pushed it to hundreds of millions. Billions, figures the 1864 archivist would later demolish with the receipts in his hand. And where the real arrangement was sordid, the books made it satanic, comparing the king to Tiberius, to Nero, to the worst monsters Rome ever produced, and the house to a Roman orgy. The receipts said one thing, the bestseller list said another. Guess which one France read? So yeah, not great if you happen to be the dynasty in question. Now, I want to be honest with you about something, because this audience corrects sloppy history in the comments, and you would be right to. There is a real argument among historians about how much these books actually moved the public before 1789. The historian Simon Burrows has pushed back hard, arguing that some of the most notorious of these texts circulated far more widely after the revolution had already started than before it. So I am not going to tell you the Parc-aux-Cerfs caused the French Revolution. It did not. What it did was something more specific and, in a way, more chilling. It helped strip the king of the one thing that made a king, because the King of France was not just a politician. He was sacred. He was anointed with holy oil at his coronation, believed to heal disease with his touch, a figure standing halfway between France and God. You cannot run a 1,000-year monarchy on tax policy alone. You run it on awe, and awe is fragile. The Lebels understood this perfectly. They did not argue that Louis XV was a bad administrator. They made him disgusting. They turned the sacred body of the king into a punchline about a backstair brothel. Once a nation is laughing at the king's body in the gutter, the holy oil has already stopped working. You just do not know it yet. That was the warning sign. The monarchy ignored it. Louis XV died on the 10th of May 1774 of smallpox in a room at Versailles that emptied out as the disease took hold, courtiers fleeing the contagion and the stench. The man France had once crowned the beloved died very nearly alone, and the city that had called him Herod did not pretend to grieve. Up to this point, the monarchy had been the most secure institution in Europe. Untouchable, eternal, the natural order of the world. That was about to flip. His grandson became Louis XVI, a decent, dull, well-meaning man who had personally done none of the things the pamphlets described and inherited every ounce of the contempt anyway. The machine that had been built to slander his grandfather simply kept running, and it found a fresh target in his queen, an Austrian girl named Marie Antoinette, who got her own library of filthy pamphlets, her own invented orgies, her own version of the secret vice story. The blood libel did not retire when Louis XV did. It was handed down like a family curse. And here is the irony that the whole story turns on. The very secrecy that the monarchy used to protect its dignity, the silence around the Parc-aux-Cerfs, the refusal to ever explain or defend, was the exact thing that destroyed that dignity. A crown that will not answer a lie has effectively agreed to it. The Bourbons never built a defense, because they believed a king does not have to explain himself to his subjects. The pamphleteers believed the opposite, and the pamphleteers won. In 1789 it came down. The Bastille, the Tuileries, the abolition of the monarchy in 1792. And on the 21st of January 1793, they took Louis XVI, grandson of the man with the secret house, to a scaffold in what is now the Place de la Concorde, and they cut off his head in front of a crowd. There is even a revolutionary pamphlet from 1790 that comes right out and blames the Parc-aux-Cerfs by name for the national debt that helped trigger the collapse. The house had become a founding myth of the revolution that buried the dynasty. A king who let himself be turned into a story he never bothered to correct. By the end, the story was all anyone could see. Most people never heard about what happened to the people inside that story after the curtain came down. The women, the children, the bloodline itself. That is the part nobody tells, and it is the strangest part of all. Start with Marie-Louise O'Murphy, the girl from the Boucher painting. The one I told you to remember. She did not fade quietly into the provinces. She outlived the king by 40 years. She outlived 2 husbands, married a third, who was nearly 30 years younger than her, and somehow survived the terror itself, arrested as a suspect, locked up under her own Irish name, and released alive when so many around her were not. She died in Paris in December 1814, an old woman in a city that had executed her royal lover's grandson 21 years before. The teenage model, from the most reproduced erotic painting of the century, lived long enough to see the entire world that made her torn to the ground. And there is one more thread, and the sources are careful about it, so I will be too. O'Murphy had a son, Louis-Charles-Antoine de Beaufranchet, born of her marriage and almost certainly fathered by her husband, not the king. He became a general in the armies of the Revolution, and according to the record, this general was probably present, on the staff of the commanding officer, on the day they executed Louis XVI. Sit with that. The son of a Parc-aux-Cerfs woman standing in the square in uniform, the morning they killed the grandson of the king his mother had served. History does not usually close its loops that cleanly. This one it did. Now the bloodline, the crown itself, where did it go? The legitimate male line of Louis XV, the actual royal succession, the sons of sons, ran out. Louis XVI was executed. His little boy, the child the royalists called Louis XVII, died in a revolutionary prison at the age of 10. The crown passed sideways to Louis XV's other grandsons, who returned briefly after the revolution, and then to one last figure. His name was Henri, the Count of Chambord, a grandson of one of Louis XV's grandsons. He was, in the precise words of the genealogists, the last legitimate descendant of Louis XV in the male line. In 1873, France actually offered him the throne back. He refused it over an argument about which flag the country would fly, walked away from a crown, and then died childless in 1883 at a chateau in Austria. With him, the direct male line of Louis XV, the line that ran straight through the king of the secret house, simply ended, snuffed out in a quiet room in Frosdorf, far from Versailles, with no son to carry it. So is there anyone left? There is a man alive today, born in Madrid in 1974, named Louis-Alphonse de Bourbon, the Duke of Anjou. To a faction of French royalists called the Legitimists, he is the rightful king of France. They call him Louis XX, and here is where you have to be precise, because the easy version is wrong. Louis Alphonse is not a direct descendant of Louis XV. His line branched off earlier, from Louis XIV, through the Spanish Bourbons, the family that has sat on the throne of Smation trees. He carries the senior claim of the whole House of Bourbon, but the specific blood of the king with the secret house does not run to him in the male line. That line died with Chambord. There is one more wrinkle, and it is the kind of thing this story seems to specialize in. Louis Alphonse's other grandfather, on his mother's side, was Francisco Franco, the dictator of Spain. The man some French royalists hail as the heir to the St. Kinding is also the grandson of a 20th century strongman, and the actual blood of Louis XV. The genealogist Joseph Valancel spent a career tracing it, and the answer is that it survives, but not on any throne. It comes down through daughters, through the illegitimate children the king paid to hide, into ordinary French families who carry a king's blood and no crown, no title, no claim. The descendants of the most powerful man in 18th century Europe are out there right now, living completely unremarkable lives, most of them with no idea that the scandal that helped end a 1,000-year monarchy is sitting somewhere in their family tree. The throne is claimed by a man who does not descend from him. The descent runs to people who do not claim the throne. Even in the end, the truth and the legend refuse to line up. In May of 1750, a Paris mob beat a man to death in the street because they believed their king kept a secret house full of stolen children and bathed in their blood. Except now you know what was really there. A small townhouse, one young woman at a time, a valet, a stack of dowry payments, and around 30 lives over 16 years. Sordid, yes. A monstrous engine of child murder, no. The mob was wrong about the house. But they understood something the king never did. They understood that a crown is only as solid as the story people tell about it. Louis XV had the armies, the palace, the holy oil, the oldest throne in Europe. What he did not have, and never thought he needed, was control of his own story. He let the lie stand. And the lie, in the end, outlasted the dynasty. He thought he was a king. France decided he was Herod. Only one of those survived him. If you want to see what happens when a royal family's private rot is dragged into public and weaponized until the whole dynasty falls, the Romanovs lived through the exact same machine, and I traced where every branch of that family ended up. That video is on screen now. I will see you inside it.